Yeah, we were talking about Zelda. I want to talk about Breath of the Wild because I think it's a very interesting sequel. I mean, Zelda as a franchise is an interesting franchise because it's constantly, we were talking about it before, it constantly changes itself up with like every single release. There's no, with very few exceptions, there's like no continuing story. I mean, there is and there isn't.
There's
kind of
not.
depending on.
We just
Not
ignore
really.
that.
I mean,
book.
the only part that I would
The
say that's like a
official
direct.
timeline.
I would only say like I think the only direct sequels are like Majora's Mask.
Majora's
is
Mask
like
is
a
Phantom
pretty-
Hourglass and
pretty-
Spirit Train are direct sequels.
Oh
but-
yeah.
Right, but for the most part, they're all disconnected. They all play very differently. And what I think is so interesting about Breath of the Wild is that, first of all, it is like it is unlike any Zelda. Like you can even if so, they're all different. You can still kind of seek out those like core mechanical pillars that make a Zelda game, whereas this one kind of removes them entirely. And what I think is so interesting, a lot of people were pointing this out when the game first came out, was that it's very reminiscent of the original like NES game in so many ways, and it almost feels like a remake of the original, but like if it was not a one-to-one remake, but it was like how would that game be made today, you know? And that's what I find. That's what I find so interesting about it, is that it's like the first game, the original, was very open-ended. It really didn't tell you that much, and you just kind of had to figure things out on your own. And I feel like Breath of the Wild brings a lot of that kind of open-ended design back. But because it's so many years later, they just go like ham with it. They just go all the way because of their, because of the technology that we have now and the experience that a lot of the same designers have and stuff like that. It's such an interesting evolution of the original to where we are now, and how they're so reminiscent in a lot of ways.
We have a sexy red fish man and a bird with an accordion, and the world's better for it.
I also think it's very interesting that like Breath of the Wild, you tend to find two opinions shared by the same people. Like everyone who plays the game that played older Zeldas tends to think both of these things, of like the gameplay is the best Zelda's ever been by like a large margin. Breath of the Wild is just such a joy to play all the time. And like I just went back and have been playing it recently, testing out some cool like things people have learned, like the bomb impact launches are just fun. But there's stuff in that game that like is so bonkers good that it elevates the entire experience past what it would otherwise be. Because like Breath of the Wild story is nothing that special, especially because most of it happened 100 years ago, and you're having that issue of like you're learning about events that you weren't involved in. There's the whole thing where like Link being a silent protagonist is kind of becoming more of an issue here, because you learn that Link does talk. If you read the logs, Link is not mute. He talks to Zelda, but then you just never hear him say anything for the entire game, because you listen to like a Zelda thing and she's like, oh yeah, he does talk occasionally, but he's just like super introverted.
No, it's just Zelda's hearing voices. She's just crazy.
It's weird because you also then talk to all the crazy NPCs and whatnot. You have conversations with them, but they're just not voice acted, which is weird. So there's lots of like little things in Breath of the Wild that tend to irk people, and then the fact that like the 4 dungeons are the same thing 4 times. They're all really cool and really well designed, but like visually they're the same thing 4 times. Which is also the same thing 120 times as you do every one of the shrines, which are the exact same aesthetic. So yeah, I find it really interesting that there's 2 opinions of like people that played that game that love Zelda still tend to think it's like the best Zelda game, even if they think it did a lot of things poorly.
The evil banana ninja dungeon, I think, was a nice.
Yeah, that's like my favorite bit of the game because it's very different.
Yep, and it's interesting too because a lot of people are like, "Oh, there's not enough. Like, this doesn't feel enough like a Zelda game to me." But I think there's just as many people who will argue that, like, no, this is the most Zelda game that a Zelda game has been in a really long time.
Well, I think like everything aside from the fact that there's so little variation in dungeons, I would agree with that sentiment of like it's a very Zelda game, but it's just missing like a few things. Like the hook shot would be such a fun thing to have in Breath of the Wild. They need to really do some crazy balancing with it, because it would break the climbing. But
there's the banana ninja dungeon. There's also the island where you lose all your gear.
Yeah, but that's also just like visually the same. Zelda's always been known for having those like wildly creative dungeon spaces of like the water temple, as much as people hate it, is still super unique and interesting.
It's different than the rest of the world, yeah.
And like I played Twilight Princess a little while ago, and playing through that game, like outwardly you might think it's just like very gray and brown, but Twilight Princess has some astoundingly well-made areas, and I think like the best visual design of any Zelda game, because it's got so many cool areas, and like it feels like a landscape. Whereas I think Breath of the Wild it needed like a big city or something. It needed Hyrule to be there, or something else that was not these small towns, or more interactions.
You technically had Hyrule Castle.
Exactly, but it was just like empty. There was so little like dragging you along, because like Twilight Princess has a lot of narrative, like a lot. There's like 40 hours worth of story in that game, and Breath of the Wild has like maybe 3 hours worth of story, if that, which I think is a little.
If you go for all the cutscenes.
Yeah, if you do all of it, which Breath of the Wild 2 is probably going to be different, because it's continuing. But I'm excited to see what that looks like.
The teaser with both of them in the cave.
Oh yeah,
I'm waiting, Nintendo.
It's been like 2 years.
It is an interesting argument of people like, well, does it feel more like a Zelda game or doesn't it? Because I think what made the original so such a favorite game back in the day was that it was so open-ended, and it told you so little information, and there was a legitimate adventure to it. And as the series went along, there became a very set structure and way that a Zelda game has to be. And so it became this thing where it was a lot less sort of open-ended. Like there may have been like open areas and an open world, but you had to go to very specific locations in a very specific order. And I think that kind of started with Link to the Past and kind of onward. And so this is the first one that's really like broken the chains, and it's just like you can go to Gerudo Valley first, you can go to the mountain area first, you can go to the volcano. Like it doesn't matter. You can do whatever order you want to do it in. And for a lot of people, that was what Zelda was for the longest time. And so that structure isn't there. And so it's either like you're a fan of that kind of structured gameplay that most of the series has had, or you're more of a fan of what the original had, which was very open-ended. You just kind of have to figure things out for yourself. I don't know. It's an interesting back and forth, I guess.
Well, I think what kind of happened in this, what those people are talking about, they don't have an issue with the like doing it in whatever order. That's all fine, and like that's really good. And if I remember correctly, Twilight Princess and Wind Waker had things like that too, where you could do some dungeons in like whatever order you wanted. Instead of Ocarina of Time, you could do a couple of sequences of things in like whatever order. And like Wind Waker was also a super open game of like you literally go sailing and can go anywhere after the first island. So I don't think it's a case of like Zelda was super rigid. Twilight Princess kind of was. Like that was Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword's thing of they were a little bit more railroady. But I think they took all that out for Breath of the Wild, which was probably a good thing. But they didn't add anything back. Like they didn't add that narrative push of like the through line of characters that are supposed to guide you through to the end, and that you have like these cool interactions with the memorable merchants and whatnot.
I think the push for me personally, anyway, I think the push is that they always did a good job of putting story beats in interesting locations or things that you haven't seen before. So whatever in the environment would draw your eye towards something is where where you can continue the story there. Like, oh, what's that big volcano? Like what's over there? And there's a whole part of the story takes place on that volcano. So I think I think what they were trying to go for was like, again, they're really trying to push exploration and kind of figuring things out for yourself. And so I think they always tried to place story beats in the most interesting standout locations. And so I think
but like it's just missing those segments of like having a reason to go through a dungeon that is visually unique. Like you have a reason to do the Divine Beasts, but it's not that compelling. Go ahead, Brett.
And I'm more on the probably more dramatically on the Ryan side of things than even Ryan is, because I've like that's the reason that I've played like 5 hours of the game and just haven't felt like doing more. Like I got off the plateau. I went to see a new thing, and a rock came out of the ground and obliterated me, and I couldn't even touch it because I couldn't do enough damage, because I guess I went to the wrong place first because there was nothing telling me that I couldn't go there. But like I don't know. There's just not enough to pull me along. There's not enough motivation.
But wouldn't you rather have like an experience the gameplay that tells you, oh, you're not ready for that, or would you just rather have an Ubisoft style thing where it's like, oh, you're heading into an area that's a little over level, be careful? Or would you rather experience that in the gameplay and be like, oh, okay,
I
obviously
mean, we can
I
have
can't
both.
go there.
Like it's
Well,
not
yeah,
a
you can
one
have
or the other
both.
thing.
You can also just like have something be
No.
really hard. Oh, I probably shouldn't be able to do this yet, and then like be able to do it anyway with your own skill instead of realizing that, oh, I hit this thing, and the health
I
circle
mean,
did
you
not go
can
down.
though. I mean, there are people who like as soon as they leave the Great Plateau, they can go right to the boss, and if
Well,
you're good enough.
Yeah, if you're good enough,
There's
okay, and
people
I'll
who
play the
beat
game
Dark
with the
Souls
Guitar
by
Hero controller too.
swirling around 720 degrees every time and parrying behind the back every single enemy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think
Goes up
it's just
against-
that like there's so little through line in Breath of the Wild unless
Yeah.
you actively seek it out, and even when you actively seek it out, it kind of ends. Like the issue with that whole separation thing is that if I go do the Gerudo stuff first, which I'm doing in my current playthrough, I have a lot of fun with the characters there and everything, and then they just stop. They just stop until the end of the game, which is going to be whenever I fight Ganon. And even then, there's nothing after that. The world just goes back to the state before you fought Ganon, which is like...
That's disappointing. No, that I completely agree with you on that front.
It just feels like
for
these
me-
characters get no reward or no storyline. Whereas a game like Wind Waker or Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword even had a lot of interesting characters, a lot of interesting development that happens, and none of that is stuff that you can't have with Breath of the Wild's openness.
With the main champions, it's just like, yeah, they're dead.
They're all
There's
dead.
No more character development.
One simple change could have made that, just make them not dead.
Crazy
I
how that
think-
works.
I think for me, what made me want to do the shrines is, first of all, they're fast travel spots, which makes getting around the world super easy, and so that was a good motivator for me. Second of all, you get what are they called, spirit orbs, right? Which you can then use to increase your health or your stamina. And so, because you want to be able to get around the world and you want to be able to fight more in combat, I think those are plenty. I think that's enough motivation for me from a gameplay perspective to be like,
I
no,
mean,
these
those are all
things I
gameplay
wanna seek out.
perspective. Like that's where the issue is. They're all gameplay related. And like I'm a systems designer. I love gameplay. Gameplay is my thing. But if you don't have a narrative reason for you to be doing these things, like I think part of the issue is like you can go fight Ganon at the start and kill him. But you can also progress to the end, and there's this weird balance where like if you do all the storyline as if they kind of want you to in Breath of the Wild, you are going to be horrendously overpowered by the time you fight Ganon, like horrendously.
Yep,
And
I
they
waited too
also
long.
get rid of his health.
Yep,
well.
they
Yep.
make the fight so much easier. And I think it would have been you could have done something a little more interesting of like maybe doing the 4 Divine Beasts unlocks like a second phase of the fight or something. That is more interesting. Like have a bit of narrative locked behind doing the rest of the game, just as a little drive to incentivize you.
I do agree. I think after the reason I haven't gone for a second playthrough is that for me, it's because I know how the world works now. There isn't that like mystery anymore. It makes it a lot less interesting for me to play. But not that it isn't a fun game to play on its own. But I think what I was really interested in from a narrative perspective was the entire game is just you like choosing when to fight the boss, and so the entire narrative is like doing these things to like slowly get you up to that power level, right? Where it's like, I don't think I'm ready yet, so I'm going to go off and do my own story and kind of do my own thing until I am ready. And I thought that was a really interesting, like very open-ended narrative kind of thing. Where
See,
like,
that's where Breath
there's
of the
very
Wild
few
breaks
things-
for me, is because I agree with you that that's a really cool driving force until I beat Ganon, go back out in the world, start exploring, and run upon a camp of enemies that is far harder than Ganon could ever have been.
I completely agree with
that's
you
where,
there.
yeah. See, I think we're making the same point of like, I still think Breath of the Wild is a 9 or a 10. Like, I think Breath of the Wild is one of those few games that is so good on the gameplay front, it can deserve a 10 out of 10 just because of how fun it is. Like, I've played so few games that are as fun as Breath of the Wild is. But then it's just lacking some Zelda things, and I'm really hoping the second brings, because Twilight Princess is super interesting because the story's super interesting. Like, it has a good narrative, and Breath of the Wild has a iffy to bad narrative for a lot of it, especially with the voice acting.
Go ahead, Ash.
If it wasn't obvious from all the talking I do about Uncharted and things like that, I'm in games for the story mm, vast majority of the time first. And I keep on, suggesting to myself, like, oh, you should go back and play Breath of the Wild again. And I keep trying to. And I do it for maybe 30 minutes at a time because I've just done all the stuff that was of interest to me. And I contemplate getting the DLC for it. I'm just like, no, it just really feels like more of the same.
I wasn't impressed by the DLC personally.
Yeah, DLC was kind of low effort, which is a shame because the motorcycle is really fun.